None of this happened in a vacuum either. Before the blockade returned in July, there were direct negotiations happening between American and Iranian representatives. Vice President Vance was among those pushing to keep the diplomatic door open, arguing that the kind of asymmetric threats Iran can pose in the Strait mean a lasting resolution really has to come through negotiation, not bombing alone. But those talks kept running into the same wall. The core disagreement wasn't really about tolls or shipping lanes, it was about Iran's nuclear program. The United States wanted it gone. Iran treated any demand to dismantle it as an unacceptable humiliation, a line it refused to cross regardless of the military and economic cost of refusing. That gap never closed. And every time diplomacy failed to bridge it, the war resumed exactly where it left off, sometimes worse than before. Meanwhile, the technology behind this blockade deserves its own moment of attention, because it's easy to talk about ships and forget just how connected modern naval warfare actually is. American destroyers in the region use an integrated radar and defense network that shares information across every ship in real time. If one vessel detects an incoming drone or missile, that information isn't just useful to that one ship, it's instantly shared across the entire formation, allowing multiple ships to respond together before the threat even gets close. Submarines contribute their own picture of the underwater environment without ever needing to surface or reveal their position. Aircraft overhead extend the surveillance net even further, well beyond what any single ship's radar could see on its own. What this means in practical terms is that Iran isn't just facing a handful of powerful warships. It's facing an entire connected system that behaves almost like a single organism, sensing, sharing, and reacting together. The kind of small boat swarm tactics that Iran has used in the past, overwhelming a single ship from multiple directions at once, were designed to beat an older kind of naval defense. They weren't designed to beat a networked system where every platform contributes to defending every other platform simultaneously. This is part of why, despite months of fighting, Iran hasn't been able to meaningfully challenge the blockade at sea. It isn't a lack of aggression, it's a mismatch in capability that keeps getting more obvious the longer this drags on. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about understanding this conflict properly, not just skimming headlines. So do me one favor, drop a comment with what part of this story surprised you the most. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who are trying to make sense of what's happening right now. So where does this actually go from here? That's the question everyone, from oil traders to world leaders, is quietly asking. There are really only a handful of paths available to the Iranian regime, and none of them look easy. One option is to try to physically challenge the blockade, using whatever naval capability remains, but this has already been tried in different forms throughout the war, and the outcome has been consistent. Vessels that attempt direct confrontation with modern destroyers backed by air cover and submarine support don't win those encounters. It isn't a matter of bravery, it's a matter of technology gaps that bravery alone can't close. Yet military logic and political logic don't always agree. Hardliners inside Iran's power structure, the ones who see any restraint as weakness, may continue pushing for exactly this kind of confrontation, even when the numbers say it's a losing move. Another option is to escalate strikes against neighboring Gulf countries, the kind of threat Iranian officials have floated more than once, but this path carries enormous risk for Iran itself. Countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain aren't neutral bystanders anymore. Some have already contributed aircraft to operations against Iranian targets. Their economies depend heavily on the very ports and shipping lanes Iran would be threatening. Attacking them risks turning a two-country war into a coordinated regional response, backed by American support, aimed squarely at a regime already stretched thin on multiple fronts. The third option, and arguably the most rational one, is to simply absorb the economic pain of the blockade, while trying, once again, to find a diplomatic off-ramp. This is clearly the path some voices within Iran's own government have quietly pushed for. But absorbing that pain isn't free either. Every week the blockade continues, oil revenue keeps draining. Every dollar that doesn't reach government coffers is a dollar that can't be used to maintain the loyalty systems that keep the regime's internal structure intact. It's a slow bleed, but a real one. And slow bleeds have a way of eventually forcing decisions that quick shocks never could. What makes this moment different from previous flashpoints in the broader Middle East conflict isn't the intensity of any single strike or any single week of fighting. Tease the method. Blockades aren't dramatic in the way missile strikes are. There's no explosion to show on the news every night. But economically, they're often more effective because they don't just damage infrastructure, they damage the ability of a regime to fund itself, to pay the people who keep it in power, and to maintain the appearance of stability to its own population. There's also a broader diplomatic backdrop worth mentioning. Global voices, including religious and humanitarian leaders, have called for peace throughout this conflict, urging all sides to find a better path than continued warfare. That call for peace is sincere, and it reflects a genuine concern for the human cost of this war on ordinary people caught in the middle of it, people who didn't choose this conflict and are the ones actually living through blackouts, shortages, and fear. Whatever side of this debate you land on, that human cost deserves to be taken seriously, and it's easy to lose sight of it when the conversation gets dominated by ships, radar systems, and strategic maps. At the same time, American officials argue that the blockade itself is meant to shorten this war, not prolong it, by targeting the regime's financial lifeline rather than its cities or civilian population directly. Whether that argument holds up depends heavily on how long the standoff actually lasts, and how the regime chooses to respond to mounting pressure it clearly wasn't fully prepared for. Before we get to where this leaves us, if you've been enjoying this breakdown, tap that like button right now. It's a small action, but it tells this platform to put this video in front of more people who are genuinely trying to understand what's unfolding in the Gulf instead of just scrolling past another headline. Here's the part of this story that's easy to miss if you only follow the daily headlines. Wars are usually judged by their loudest moments, the missile strikes, the burning tankers, the dramatic footage. But this blockade represents something quieter and, in some ways, more decisive. It's a slow-motion pressure campaign, built not to destroy Iran's military outright, but to hollow out the financial system that keeps its most powerful institution loyal to the people currently in charge. Iran spent decades treating the Strait of Hormuz as its ultimate bargaining chip, the one card it could always play if pushed into a corner. Threaten to close it, and the world pays attention. Threaten to close it, and oil prices jump, and suddenly a regional power has global leverage. That strategy worked in various forms for a very long time. But leverage only works as long as the other side has to respect it. And what's happened over these past several months is that the United States effectively called that bluff, not by trying to force the strait open through the middle, but by shutting down Iran's own access to it entirely. The world's shipping still moves. Oil still flows to most buyers. The only entity actually being strangled by this blockade is the regime that built its entire strategy around threatening to strangle everyone else. That's the twist sitting at the center of this whole conflict. The very choke point Iran spent 40 years positioning as its ultimate weapon has become the exact instrument being used against it. The mines meant to keep American ships away pushed commercial traffic straight into the safest zone for American enforcement. The drones meant to punish tankers keep getting shot down before they matter. The propaganda meant to show strength keeps revealing how much strain the regime is actually under. Every tool built to project power outward has, one by one, turned into evidence of how much pressure is building on the inside. And that pressure isn't abstract. It's showing up in empty government coffers. It's showing up in a navy that can no longer credibly challenge American ships at sea. It's showing up in a population growing more exhausted by the day, watching a war drag on with promises of victory that never quite arrive. Regimes don't usually collapse from a single knockout blow. They erode, slowly, from pressures like this one, compounding week after week until something finally gives. Nobody watching this conflict, whether they support America's approach or oppose it, can honestly say they know exactly how this ends. Maybe diplomacy finds its footing again, the way it briefly did back in April. Maybe the regime absorbs the pain and waits it out, betting that American patience runs out before Iranian resources do. Or maybe the internal pressure building inside Iran's own government eventually forces a decision nobody outside that country gets to see coming until it happens. What we do know is this: the Strait of Hormuz, the waterway Iran spent generations turning into its most powerful piece of leverage, is currently open to almost the entire world and closed only to the one country that built its entire strategy around controlling it. That's not a small detail. That's the story underneath every headline about strikes, tankers, and blockades. A regime that believed it held the world's oil supply hostage is now discovering that the hand actually gripping that leverage no longer belongs to it. However this chapter ends, it's going to reshape how the world thinks about naval power, economic pressure, and what it really takes to bring a determined regime to the negotiating table without a single boot ever touching the ground. If this breakdown helped you actually understand what's happening in the Gulf right now, instead of just seeing another confusing headline, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe if you want to keep getting the full picture as this story continues to develop, because there's a lot more still coming, and you'll want to be here when it does. Let's dig into what is actually measurable here, because there is a real difference between what has clearly changed and what almost certainly has not. What has changed is Iran's ability to sustain a large, coordinated, high-frequency campaign against shipping using a single unified command structure. Months of American and Israeli strikes have specifically targeted Iranian launch sites, drone production facilities, and the officers who used to coordinate these operations. Alireza Tangsiri, the senior Iranian naval commander who had overseen the entire blockade strategy in the Strait, was killed early in the campaign. When you remove the person coordinating an entire operation, and you keep hitting the physical sites that operation depends on, week after week, month after month, something does genuinely break. Not necessarily the desire to keep fighting, but the machinery needed to fight in one single, organized, large-scale way. This is the part almost nobody explains clearly enough. There's a real difference between a country choosing to pause its attacks and a country losing the actual physical and organizational ability to launch attacks the way it used to. If Iran simply chose to slow down, it could, in theory, ramp back up whenever it wanted, the moment it decided the timing was right. But if the launch sites are destroyed, if the command structure that used to coordinate those launches is gone, if the officers who knew how to run large synchronized strikes are dead, then ramping back up is not a decision anymore. It is an engineering problem, and engineering problems take months or years to solve, not a single order from Tehran. That distinction matters enormously because it changes what a quiet week in the Strait actually tells you. A quiet week could mean Iran is choosing patience, or it could mean Iran currently lacks the coordinated capacity to do what it used to do, and is instead falling back on smaller, scattered, harder to predict attacks using leftover equipment and improvised tactics. Recent events actually point toward that second, messier picture. Attacks on shipping have not stopped. They have become less centralized, more scattered, sometimes unclaimed for hours after they happen, hitting vessels in places as far apart as the Red Sea and waters close to Kish Island. In just the past several days, a large crude tanker was struck by drones while sailing in ballast through the strait. An engine room explosion tore through a vessel anchored near an outside port limit zone close to Dubai, and a cruise missile hit another ship south of Kish Island, leaving hull damage above the waterline. None of that reads like silence. It reads like an opponent firing whatever it still has, wherever it still can, without the old centralized coordination it used to rely on. That does not look like a silent, defeated opponent. It looks like a wounded one that has lost its old playbook, but is still improvising with whatever tools remain. Which brings us to the second scoreboard, the one that almost nobody puts a number on, because you cannot put a number on it. Political will. Here is the honest, uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire war. For Iran's government, this conflict is not just another foreign policy dispute. It is existential. It is tied to decades of national identity built around resisting American and Israeli pressure. It is tied to the survival of the regime itself, especially after the killing of its own supreme leader in the opening hours of the war. For a government facing that kind of stakes, absorbing months of economic pain and military losses, is not something extra. It is simply the cost of staying in power at all. Now compare that to what most people in the country carrying out these strikes actually want out of this war. Broadly speaking, most ordinary Americans are not thinking about regional power balances in the Persian Gulf. They are thinking about the number on the gas pump. They are thinking about whether their flights cost more this year. For most people, watching this unfold from thousands of miles away, the honest hope is simply that the war ends soon and quietly, and life goes back to something normal. That is a genuinely massive mismatch in what each side is risking. One side is fighting because losing might mean the collapse of the entire government. The other side is fighting a war that, while serious and expensive, is not existential for its own political system back home. And here is the part that makes that asymmetry sharper than it might first appear. Iran's government does not answer to an election. It does not face a fixed date where ordinary citizens can simply vote it out over high prices or battlefield losses. A democratic government does face exactly that kind of clock, ticking in the background every single day. And there is a very specific date attached to that clock right now. The United States has midterm congressional elections coming up in November. That is not an abstract, someday kind of pressure. That is a concrete deadline where rising oil prices, an unresolved war, and mounting military costs can get converted directly into actual votes against the party in power. It would be naive to assume Iranian strategists have not noticed that exact same calendar sitting on the wall. This is genuinely one of the more uncomfortable ideas in this entire story, so let's sit with it for a second instead of rushing past it. A strategy built around simply outlasting another government's patience sounds weak on the surface. It sounds like admitting you cannot win the actual fight. But it is not automatically a losing strategy. It has worked before in other wars, in other decades, precisely because democratic governments have a built-in expiration date on how much economic pain their own voters will quietly tolerate. And authoritarian governments, for better or worse, usually do not share that same limitation. I know that is not a comfortable thing to hear if you were hoping for a clean, satisfying answer about who is actually winning here. But accuracy is more valuable than comfort, and this war genuinely does not offer a comfortable, tidy answer yet. There is also something worth naming honestly about how the goals of this war have shifted over time, because that shift matters more than it first seems. When this war began in February, The stated aim was dismantling Iran's nuclear program and its top military leadership. As the months went on, that goal quietly expanded into weakening Iran's broader military capability. Then it expanded again into changing Iran's regional behavior more generally. And now, in the middle of the Strait crisis, the most visible goal on any given day is simply reopening safe passage for commercial ships. Every one of those goals is legitimate on its own terms. But a war whose finish line keeps moving is a much harder war to declare won cleanly. There is no single obvious moment where anyone can point at a calendar and say, that was the day it ended, mission accomplished, full stop. And that kind of ambiguity is exactly the space a defiant government can keep operating inside, indefinitely, without ever technically admitting defeat. Before we go further, I want to pause and actually ask you something, instead of just talking at you. Which side of this do you find more convincing right now? The argument that Iran's capability is genuinely broken, or the argument that its political will is still very much intact? Drop that answer in the comments. And while you are there, go ahead and share this video with one person who still thinks this war is basically already over, because based on everything we have covered so far, that is far from settled. Now let's talk about why simply grinding down Iranian firepower, even successfully, might still not be enough to end this on its own, because there is real historical precedent here, and it is genuinely humbling. Decades ago, during an earlier period of tension in the same waters, the United States ran a similar strategy, escorting tankers through the Gulf to protect them from Iranian attacks. That earlier convoy strategy worked, in a narrow sense. It deterred direct attacks on escorted ships. It pushed Iran toward less effective tactics. It helped contain the fighting largely to the water, instead of letting it spread further. But here's the important part. The convoys alone did not end that standoff. What actually ended it was a combination of several separate things happening at once. Battlefield losses for Iran elsewhere in that earlier war, a real collapse in Iranian morale at the time, and, tragically, an accidental American shoot-down of an Iranian civilian airliner that killed everyone aboard, an event nobody had planned and nobody wanted, but one that permanently changed the calculation on both sides. That history matters here because it tells you something uncomfortable about how these standoffs actually end. Even a fully successful military tool, a blockade, an escort mission, a bombing campaign, rarely closes out a conflict like this entirely by itself. Real endings tend to come from a messy mix of unplanned pressures, some military, some economic, some tragically accidental, all arriving at roughly the same time. It is worth sitting with that historical case for a moment longer, because it is genuinely humbling in a way that most modern war coverage does not have patience for. The convoy escorts back then were, by every military measure, a success. Fewer ships were hit while under escort. Iran was pushed toward smaller, less effective tactics instead of open confrontation. On paper, that success story alone should have been enough to end the standoff. It was not enough. What actually closed the chapter was a combination nobody could have planned on a whiteboard in advance, including one accidental tragedy that changed the entire political calculation overnight. That is, the uncomfortable lesson sitting underneath decades of history in these same waters. Military success and political resolution are not the same event, and one does not automatically produce the other, no matter how decisive that military success looks in the moment. And today's version of this standoff is genuinely harder than that earlier one. Even with Iran's centralized command structure damaged, Iran still has real residual capability scattered across the region. Large numbers of small attack boats, coastal missile and rocket units, drones that can be launched from locations more than 1,000 miles inland, far outside the strait itself, making them much harder to preemptively destroy. None of that requires the kind of large, centralized coordination that has been degraded. It only requires scattered local initiative, and unfortunately, that's exactly the kind of attack we have kept seeing in just the past few days. There's one more thread worth pulling here, because it connects this war to a completely different conflict most people are not mentally linking together. Iran has spent years supplying its own drone designs to Russia for use in Russia's war in Ukraine. That relationship runs deep. Russia has come to depend heavily on Iranian drone technology for its own war effort. A country that deeply invested in Iran's drone production has a real incentive to help keep that production running, if for no other reason than protecting a supply chain it has come to rely on for its own separate war. Any sign of renewed foreign resupply reaching Iran's stockpiles would be the clearest possible signal that whatever capability collapse we are seeing right now might prove temporary rather than permanent. So where does that leave us? Let's be honest about what is real and what is not, because I think that honesty is actually the most useful thing this video can give you. What is real? Iran's ability to run a large, centralized, tightly coordinated attack campaign against shipping has been genuinely damaged. Key commanders are dead. Key launch sites are destroyed. That did not happen cheaply. It took months of sustained strikes, a full naval blockade, and real risk to American and Allied personnel to get there. That is not a small accomplishment, and it deserves to be recognized honestly as real, measurable military progress. What does not appear to be real, at least not yet, is any actual collapse in Iran's political will to keep fighting. Every public statement from senior Iranian officials over these past weeks points the opposite direction: defiant, coordinated, explicitly framed around outlasting American patience rather than winning ahead on military fight. It knows it currently cannot win. And every serious, independent analysis of this war points toward the same underlying warning. Do not mistake a damaged attack tempo for a broken will to keep fighting. Those are two entirely different things, measured in two entirely different ways, and confusing them is exactly how a war like this gets declared over, long before it actually is. There's also a quieter disagreement happening inside Washington itself, and it deserves a moment of its own because it shows this is not even a single unified strategy on the American side either. Some voices in the administration have pushed hard for continued strikes, framing this as a problem that can be solved by simply destroying enough radar, enough drones, enough missile sites, until Iran physically cannot fight back anymore. Other senior voices have pushed back on that logic directly, arguing publicly that you can destroy radar systems. You can take away drones and missiles, but in a narrow waterway like this, it remains far too easy for a determined opponent to simply fire at a passing ship, no matter how much hardware you destroy beforehand. That second camp argues the only real way this fully resolves is through negotiation, not additional strikes. That disagreement matters, because it means the American side of this war is not walking in with one single confident theory of how it ends either. Two governments, each internally uncertain in its own way, both convinced the other side will eventually run out of patience first. Picture this as two separate scoreboards running side by side instead of one single score. Scoreboard 1 is tactical and military, measured in strikes, destroyed launch sites, and disrupted attacks. On that scoreboard right now, the United States and its allies are clearly ahead. Scoreboard 2 is political endurance, measured in things you cannot count as easily: public patience back home. Coalition unity among allies in the region. How long a government can keep asking its own people to absorb economic pain without a breaking point? On that second scoreboard, based on everything we have walked through, nobody has won yet. And Iran's own leadership is openly betting that it is still very much in that fight. Here is the single most important idea to take away from this entire video, more than any individual strike, any individual quote, any individual number. If Iran's actual strategy is built around outlasting American political patience rather than winning a direct military exchange it currently cannot win, then a headline announcing that Iran's will has been broken is not just early. It might be measuring the wrong thing entirely. You could watch Iranian attack numbers keep falling for months and still learn nothing about the one variable that actually decides how this ends. Whether political tolerance back in Washington for high oil prices, mounting military costs, and an open-ended war in the Gulf runs out before Tehran's own patience does. Those two numbers are not the same thing, and they do not move together. That is an uncomfortable idea to sit with, because it means the side that is clearly winning the visible military exchange right now is not automatically the side winning the actual war each government believes it is fighting. So here is a practical way to actually watch this conflict going forward. Instead of just reacting to whatever headline shows up next, every time you see a number, a strike count, a destroyed missile site, a quiet week in the Strait, ask yourself which of the two scoreboards it is actually telling you about. Tactical numbers are real and they matter, but on their own, they tell you almost nothing about whether either government's underlying willingness to keep paying the cost of this war is actually running out. There are three specific things worth watching closely from here, and none of them is simply how many more boats or missile sites get hit next week. First, watch whether Iran's public tone from senior officials stays this defiant over the coming month, or whether it quietly starts to soften even as the military numbers keep declining. A real shift in tone without a matching shift in capability would be the clearest sign yet that the political calculation, not just the military one, is genuinely starting to change. Second, watch the pressure points on the American side directly. Rising fuel costs, any American or allied casualties, any visible cracks in coalition unity among Gulf partners. Those are the exact levers. Iran's entire strategy is built around pulling, and if they start visibly shaping decisions in Washington, that tells you the strategy is working. Third, and this one connects everything we covered about Russia, watch for any confirmed evidence that Iranian stockpiles are being quietly replenished from outside the country. If that shows up as a renewed uptick in coordinated centralized attacks rather than scattered improvised ones, that would be the clearest signal that today's capability collapse is temporary, not permanent. Fourth, keep an eye on the Gulf neighbors sitting closest to all of this. If the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, or other regional partners start visibly distancing themselves from American operations, or start pushing publicly and loudly for a negotiated end instead of continued strikes, that quiet third clock we talked about earlier may be running out faster than either Washington's or Tehran's, and it could end up being the actual pressure that forces a resolution neither side originally wanted. Most coverage of a war like this picks a single side of the story and runs with it, because a clean, dramatic headline earns more attention than an honest, complicated one. Either Iran is collapsing, or Iran is defiant and unbroken, whichever version sounds more exciting that week. I think the honest version of this story is that both of those things are true right now, just about two completely different questions. Iran's military machinery for large-scale coordinated attacks does appear genuinely damaged, and Iran's political resolve to keep absorbing pain in pursuit of what it considers survival does not appear damaged at all, at least not yet. I would rather leave you holding that tension honestly than hand you a falsely clean resolution that next week's news could immediately contradict. Because that is exactly what has happened again and again throughout this war already. A ceasefire that seemed to hold until a single drone strike unraveled it within days. A quiet week in the Strait, followed by 3 ships attacked within 72 hours. This war has already punished anyone who declared it over too early, more than once. There is a broader lesson buried inside this specific war, and it is worth carrying with you well beyond this one video. Anytime you see a conflict, anywhere in the world, described purely in terms of one side's military capability collapsing, it is worth asking the follow-up question almost nobody bothers to ask. Has the other side's underlying will to keep fighting actually changed at all? Or has only the visible, easily measured capability changed, while the much harder to see political calculation underneath it has stayed exactly where it always was? Those two things get mixed together constantly in coverage of every conflict, on every side, for a very simple reason. Capability numbers are easy to report cleanly. Political resolve is not. It does not fit neatly into a headline, and it does not come with a satisfying countdown to 0. Before we get to the end here, I want to ask you for something specific, because it genuinely shapes what gets covered next. If you want the next update the moment either side of this contradiction actually resolves, whether Iran's capability keeps collapsing towards 0, or whether its political resolve finally starts to visibly crack, subscribe now, because I plan to keep tracking both of those threads, honestly, rather than defaulting to whichever one makes for a punchier headline in a given week. And if this specific way of thinking about the war, 2 separate scoreboards instead of 1 clean score, changed how you see everything you read about this conflict going forward, hit like right now, because that tells me directly to keep building these updates exactly this way. Before we close this out, I want to leave you with one more thing to actually do, not just watch. Screenshot this exact moment in the video, the part where we laid out those 4 things to watch, and check back against it in a month. See how many of them actually happened. See which ones did not. That kind of accountability is rare in war coverage because most channels move on to the next dramatic headline long before anyone checks whether their last prediction actually held up. If you want a channel that is willing to be checked like that, subscribing is the easiest way to make sure you're still here when we come back to grade it honestly. Wars like this one almost never end with one single clean moment where everyone quietly agrees who broke first. They end, when they finally do end, through some messy, unglamorous combination of exactly the pressures we just walked through together. Damaged capability on economic pain nobody can fully control. And sometimes a single unplanned event nobody saw coming, the way an accidental tragedy once helped end a very similar standoff in these same waters decades ago. Right now, in the Strait of Hormuz, American strikes are relentless, and Iranian shipping attacks have not stopped, only changed shape. Oil sits above $100 a barrel, and it is still climbing. Somewhere underneath all of those numbers is the actual answer to whether this war is close to ending or nowhere near it. But that answer is not sitting inside a strike count or a destroyed missile site or a single defiant quote from a single official. It is sitting inside something you cannot photograph and cannot count. How much longer each government believes it can keep asking its own people to pay the price of staying in this fight. That is the real question underneath the headline you clicked on. Not who has more missiles left this week, but who runs out of patience first. And right now, honestly, nobody on either side has answered that question yet. Think back to that question I asked you at the very start of this video. If a country's weapons go quiet while its leaders start talking tougher, which one of those actually tells you the war is ending? By now, you have heard every piece of evidence on both sides, the strike counts, the collapsed shipping numbers, the defiant quotes, the historical precedent, the election sitting on the calendar, the allies quietly watching their own coastlines, and the honest answer is that neither one, on its own, tells you anything close to the full story. You need both. You need the tactical scoreboard and the political scoreboard read together, side by side, updated constantly, not cherry-picked to fit whichever headline felt more satisfying that week. That is a harder way to watch a war unfold. It does not give you the clean relief of a finished story, but it is the honest way, and I think you deserve the honest way, even when it leaves things unresolved. Thank you for actually sitting through the complicated, unresolved version of this story, instead of settling for a headline that sounds satisfying, but does not hold up under a single week of new news. I will keep watching both scoreboards, and I will be back the moment either one of them actually moves. I will see you in the next one.